On a gray Tuesday morning in October of 2003, a man named Emmett Holloway backed his pickup truck to the side door of the Deere dealership on Route 9 outside of Ames, Iowa, and unloaded 4 cardboard boxes of electrical components that the service manager had told him, twice, were not worth keeping. Emmett was 61 years old. He had farmed 380 acres in Marshall County for 38 years. He had hands that looked like they had been carved from the same material as his land, and he wore the same canvas jacket he had worn since 1987. And he did not say much when the service manager told him the third time that those starters were scrap and that he was wasting his time. He just nodded, loaded the boxes back into the truck, and drove home. That was not the first time someone had told Emmett Holloway he was wasting his time. Let me tell you about Emmett Holloway, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. And what he did is the reason this story is still being told in Marshall County 20 years after the fact. Emmett was born in 1942 on the same 380 acres he would farm his entire life. His father, Gus Holloway, had bought those acres in 1931 at the bottom of the Depression when the land was selling for almost nothing, and Gus had a theory about that. Gus believed that the things other people threw away during hard times were the things that would matter most when the hard times ended. He kept everything. He kept broken plows and cracked castings and electric motors that hadn't run since the Truman administration. He kept them in a shed behind the machine barn that his wife called the museum and his neighbors called the junkyard and Gus called the library. When Emmett was 7 years old, Gus sat him down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in that shed and told him something that Emmett never forgot. He said, "The man who knows what something is worth when it's broken is the only man who's ever truly free." Emmett was 7, and he did not fully understand it. By the time he was 40, he understood it completely. Emmett was not a hoarder in the way people use that word carelessly. He was a student. He kept things because he understood them, and he understood them because he kept them and studied them and took them apart and put them back together on winter evenings when the fields were frozen and there was nothing else to do. He had an intuition about electrical systems that bordered on the supernatural, or at least that's how his neighbors described it. His neighbor, Dale Sorensen, who farmed the 600 acres to the east of Emmett's place, used to say that Emmett could diagnose a wiring fault by listening to the way a solenoid clicked. Dale said this in the way men say things they don't quite believe but can't disprove. Emmett never corrected him. The shed behind the machine barn grew over the decades. It grew the way a library grows when the librarian never throws anything away. By 2003, it contained 3 full rows of shelving made from 2x4s and rough-cut lumber, and those shelves held starter motors, alternators, voltage regulators, solenoids, armatures, field coils, and brushes representing 40 years of agricultural electrical history. There were starters from combines that had been scrapped in the 1970s. There were alternators from tractors that no longer existed as models. There were voltage regulators from machines that the manufacturers had stopped making parts for before some of Emmett's neighbors had been born. And there were the blown starters. Let me tell you about the blown starters because they are the center of this story, and they got there in a way that is worth understanding. It started, as best anyone can reconstruct it, sometime around 1983. Emmett's neighbor to the west, a man named Harlan Jessup, who farmed 240 acres and had a habit of running his equipment harder than the equipment preferred, showed up at Emmett's place one evening with a starter motor from his 1978 John Deere, 4, 4, 4. Oh, that had burned up on him during corn harvest. Harlan had called the dealership and been told the replacement was going to cost him $340 and take 2 weeks to arrive. Emmett took the starter, looked at it for about 4 minutes, told Harlan the armature was burned and the brushes were gone, but the housing and the drive assembly were fine, and asked Harlan what he wanted to do with it. Harlan said he didn't want to do anything with it. He just wanted to know if Emmett could fix the new one faster when it arrived. Emmett said yes. Harlan said fine, you can have the old one. Emmett put it on the shelf. That was how it started. Over the next 20 years, word spread the way word spreads in farming communities, which is to say slowly and thoroughly, and without anyone making a conscious decision to spread it. Farmers in Marshall County came to understand 2 things about Emmett Holloway. First, that if your electrical system failed during planting or harvest, Emmett could usually get you running again faster than the dealership could. Second, that Emmett would take the blown component off your hands when he was done, if you didn't want it. Most of them didn't want it. A burned starter was a burned starter. It was scrap. It was dead weight. It was exactly the kind of thing a sensible man threw in the metal recycling bin and forgot about. Emmett never threw them away. By the time he backed his truck up to the dealership in October of 2003, he had accumulated, by his own careful count, 67 blown starter motors from agricultural equipment spanning the years 1968 through 2001. They represented 11 different manufacturers. They represented 23 different model numbers. Some of them he had partially rebuilt, salvaging the housings and drive assemblies and field coils from machines that had given up their armatures and brushes. Some of them were complete units, burned up in ways that made the armature unusable but left everything else intact. Some of them were in pieces, sorted by component type into coffee cans and mason jars and the small cardboard boxes that spark plugs came in. The service manager at the Deere dealership had looked at 4 boxes of them and told Emmett they were scrap. Emmett had nodded and taken them home and added them to the library. He did not know, in October of 2003, that the library was about to become the most important building in Marshall County. Let me tell you about the Meridian Components plant, because without it, this story is just a man with a shed full of old parts, and that is not quite the story. The Meridian Components plant sat on the south side of Marshalltown, Iowa, and it had been there since 1961. It was not a famous plant. It was not the kind of place that appeared in newspaper stories about American manufacturing or in speeches about the heartland economy. It was a medium-sized factory that made electrical components for agricultural equipment, primarily starter motors and alternators, and it employed 340 people at its peak and about 280 people by the early 2000s. And those 280 people were, in the way of such things, woven into the fabric of Marshall County in ways that nobody fully appreciated until the weaving started to come undone. Meridian did not make components for every manufacturer. They made components for a specific range of equipment, primarily older lines that the major manufacturers had stopped actively supporting. This was their niche. This was why they had survived when larger competitors had consolidated or closed. They were the people you called when you needed a starter for a 1974 International Harvester 1066, or an alternator for a 1969 Oliver 1850, and the manufacturer's own parts network had dried up years ago. They were the last source. They knew it, and their customers knew it, and for a long time that knowledge was enough to keep the lights on. The announcement came on a Wednesday in March of 2004. The plant was closing. Not immediately. They would honor existing orders and wind down production over 6 months. But by September of 2004, Meridian Components would cease to exist as a manufacturing operation. The official reason given was that the market for legacy agricultural electrical components was no longer sufficient to sustain the operation. This was true in the narrow sense that true things are sometimes true in narrow senses. It was also true that the private equity firm that had acquired Meridian in 1999 had decided that the returns were insufficient and the real estate was worth more than the business. Both things were true at the same time, and neither truth made the situation better for the 280 people who drove to work in Marshalltown every morning. The farming community felt it differently than the plant workers did, and they felt it in a way that took longer to arrive. Let me tell you about how it arrived, because the arrival was gradual and then sudden, in the way that certain kinds of damage are gradual and then sudden. For the first year after Meridian closed, most farmers in Marshall County did not notice much of a change. They had inventory on hand. Their dealers had inventory on hand. The components Meridian had made were durable, and a starter motor that had been properly installed and properly maintained did not fail every year. The problem was invisible in the way that the problem of not having a fire department is invisible until there is a fire. The fires started arriving in 2006. A farmer named Lyle Brockman, who ran a mixed operation of corn and soybeans on 520 acres in the northeast corner of the county, lost a starter on his 1977 John Deere 4430 on the second morning of corn planting. He called the dealership. The dealership called their distributor. The distributor called 3 other distributors. The part was not available new. It had not been available new since Meridian closed. There was a remanufactured unit available from a supplier in Georgia, but the lead time was 3 weeks and the cost was $780, and Lyle Brockman needed to plant corn right now, not in 3 weeks. He sat in his machine shed for 2 days while his neighbors planted around him, and then he called Emmett Holloway. Emmett had the part. Not a new part, not a remanufactured part, but a rebuilt unit assembled from components he had accumulated over 20 years of collecting what other people threw away. He had a housing from a 1979 unit, a drive assembly from a 1976 unit, an armature he had rewound himself on a winter evening in 1998, and a set of brushes he had fabricated from raw brush stock he ordered in bulk from an electrical supply house in Des Moines. He assembled the unit in his shop, tested it on his bench, and had Lyle Brockman back in the field in 4 hours. He charged Lyle $85 for the parts and nothing for the labor, because that was how Emmett operated, and Lyle Brockman drove home feeling like a man who had been pulled out of a river. Lyle told 2 neighbors. Those neighbors told 2 more. By the end of the 2006 planting season, Emmett Holloway had rebuilt or repaired 11 starter motors and 4 alternators for farmers across Marshall County, and the word that was spreading now was different from the word that had spread before. Before, the word was that Emmett could fix things faster than the dealership. Now, the word was that Emmett could fix things that nobody else could fix at all. That distinction matters. Let me explain why it matters. When a part is available commercially, a skilled mechanic is a convenience. He saves you time and money. When a part is not available commercially, A skilled mechanic with the right components is something else entirely. He is the difference between planting and not planting. He is the difference between harvesting and not harvesting. In a farming operation running on margins that would make a city businessman weep, the difference between planting on schedule and planting 2 weeks late is not an inconvenience. It is sometimes the difference between a profitable year and a year that puts you in a conversation with your banker that you do not want to have. Emmett understood this. He had understood it since he was 7 years old, sitting on a bucket in his father's shed. Now, let me tell you about Dale Sievert, because Dale Sievert is the man who laughed, and the laugh is important to the story in the way that certain wrong notes are important to music. Dale Sievert was the service manager at the largest John Deere dealership in Marshall County, a position he had held since 1994 and held with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything in his professional life. Dale was 48 years old in 2006, broad-shouldered, with a gray mustache and a way of standing in doorways that suggested he had considered the doorway's structural integrity and found it adequate. He had built the service department from a 4-bay operation into a 12-bay operation, and he had done it by being aggressive about new equipment and new diagnostics and new systems, and he was genuinely good at his job in the context of the job as it had existed before Meridian closed. The problem was that Dale Sievert had a theory about old parts, and the theory was simple. Old parts were old parts, and the answer to old parts was new equipment. When farmers came to him with problems involving legacy electrical systems, Dale's solution was always some version of the same thing. Trade up, get a newer machine. Stop trying to keep a 1977 tractor running when a 2003 tractor would give you GPS guidance and a climate-controlled cab and a service network that actually functioned. This was not an unreasonable position from a business standpoint. It was also a position that assumed every farmer in Marshall County had the capital to trade up, and that assumption was wrong in ways that Dale Sievert had apparently never been required to confront directly. Emmett Holloway and Dale Sievert had known each other for years, in the way that men in small counties know each other, which is to say, they knew each other's names and reputations and had never had a conversation that lasted more than 5 minutes. That changed in August of 2006 at the Marshall County Farm Bureau meeting, which was held in the Fellowship Hall of the Lutheran Church in Liscombe and attended by about 60 farmers and a handful of dealers and suppliers. The meeting was, ostensibly, about crop insurance adjustments, but the conversation kept drifting to parts availability, and specifically to the gap that Meridian's closure had left, and specifically to what farmers were supposed to do when their legacy equipment failed and the commercial supply chain had nothing to offer them. Dale Sievert, who had been invited as a dealer representative, said what he usually said. He said the market was moving toward newer equipment and that the economics of maintaining 30-year-old tractors were increasingly unfavorable, and that the parts availability problem was, in a sense, the market's way of telling farmers something they needed to hear. There was a silence in the fellowship hall that had a particular texture to it. Emmett Holloway was sitting in the third row. He was wearing his canvas jacket. He had not planned to speak. He was not, by nature, a man who spoke at meetings, but he raised his hand. And when Dale Sievert nodded at him, Emmett said, "I've got parts for most of what people are running in this county. I've been collecting them for 20 years. If you need a starter for a 4430 or a 4440 or an 806 or a 1066, I've probably got what you need, or I can build what you need from what I've got." Dale Sievert looked at Emmett Holloway for a moment. Then he smiled. It was not a mean smile, exactly. It was the smile of a man who has encountered a position so far outside his frame of reference that his face doesn't know what else to do with it. "Emmett," he said, "you're talking about used parts from machines that are 30 years old. You're talking about rebuilt components that have no warranty, no certification, no quality standard. You're talking about putting a homemade starter on a machine worth $40,000 and hoping it holds." He paused. "No offense, but that's not a solution. That's a prayer." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then 3 or 4 people in the room chuckled. Not cruelly, just the reflexive release of tension that happens when someone says something that sounds sensible and slightly dismissive at the same time. Emmett nodded slowly. "Lyle Brockman planted 520 acres this spring on a starter I built," he said. "He's still running it." Dale Sievert said, "This time." Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a man be dismissed by someone who was, at that exact moment, in the process of being proven wrong? Not wrong yet in any way he could see, not wrong in any way the room could see, but wrong in the way that the future was already arranging itself to demonstrate? There is a particular quality to that moment. It has a weight to it. Emmett Holloway felt that weight, and he sat down, and he did not argue further, and the meeting moved on to crop insurance. But something had shifted. The room had heard what Emmett said, and the room was made of farmers, and farmers are people who remember things that work. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 3 years, because the 3 years between 2006 and 2009 are the years that built the proof. By the end of the 2006 harvest season, Emmett had helped 14 different farming operations in Marshall County. By the end of 2007, that number was 22. By the end of 2008, it was 31. He kept a ledger. Not a formal ledger, not a business ledger, just a spiral-bound notebook where he wrote down the date, the farmer's name, the machine, the component, what he used to fix it, and what he charged. He charged for parts at cost and nothing for labor, and the parts at cost figure was almost always dramatically lower than the commercial alternative, because Emmett's cost basis was 20 years of collecting things that other people had given him for free. He was not running a business. He was running a library, and people were borrowing from it. The components he used were not inferior to commercial replacements. This point requires some explanation because it is the point that Dale Sievert had gotten exactly backward, and understanding why he had it backward requires understanding something about how electrical components age and fail. Let me tell you about the electrical components, because the electrical components are the reason Emmett Holloway's shed was worth more than Dale Sievert's 12-bay service department when the crisis came. A starter motor fails in specific ways. The armature windings burn out, the brushes wear down, the drive assembly wears, the solenoid contacts pit and erode. These are the failure modes, and they are well understood, and they are not mysterious. What is less well understood, outside of people who have spent decades studying these components, is that the failure modes are largely independent of each other. When a starter fails, it usually fails in one or two of these modes, not all of them simultaneously. The housing is fine, the field coils are fine, the drive assembly is fine. What's failed is the armature, or the brushes, or the solenoid. Everything else is perfectly good and will remain perfectly good for decades more if it is stored properly. Emmett Holloway understood this. He had understood it since the 1970s. When a farmer gave him a blown starter, Emmett did not see a blown starter. He saw a blown armature in a good housing with good field coils and a good drive assembly. He cataloged what was good and set it aside. Over 20 years, he'd accumulated an inventory of good components that, assembled correctly from matching or compatible units, produced rebuilt starters that were in many respects superior to remanufactured commercial units, because Emmett selected his components individually and tested each one, while commercial remanufacturing operations worked at volume and tested statistically. His rebuilt starters did not fail at higher rates than commercial units. They failed at lower rates. He knew this because he kept the ledger, and the ledger told him that of the 47 starters he had rebuilt and installed between 1983 and 2006, exactly 3 had failed within the first year of service, and all 3 failures had been traceable to installation errors rather than component failures. The other 44 were still running. Dale Sievert did not know this. Dale Sievert had never asked. The summer of 2008 was dry in Marshall County. Not catastrophically dry, but dry enough that equipment ran hard and ran long, and the electrical systems on older machines took the kind of sustained load that accelerated failure. Emmett rebuilt 9 starters between June and August of 2008, more than he had rebuilt in any previous single season. He rebuilt 2 of them in the field, which is to say he drove his truck to a farm with a tool bag and a rebuilt unit and swapped it out in a machine shed while the farmer stood there watching, and then he drove home. He did not consider this remarkable. He considered it Tuesday. Word reached Dale Sievert in a roundabout way, as word tends to do in small counties. A parts manager at the dealership named Kevin, who was 26 years old and had grown up on a farm in the county and still had the instincts of someone who paid attention to what actually happened in fields rather than what appeared in service bulletins, mentioned to Dale one afternoon that Emmett Holloway had apparently kept half the county's old iron running through the summer. Dale Sievert's response, as Kevin later recalled it, was to say that it was fine for the short term, but that those farmers were going to end up with a reliability problem sooner or later, and when they did, they'd be back at the dealership buying new equipment. Kevin did not say anything. He had been working at the dealership long enough to understand which observations were welcome. Let me tell you about the winter of 2008 and 2009, because that winter is when Emmett Holloway's library became something that even Dale Sievert could not dismiss. The winter was bad, not the weather. The weather was unremarkable. What was bad was the financial system, which had decided in the fall of 2008 to demonstrate, in case anyone had forgotten, that it was capable of catastrophic failure. The farm economy felt this in specific ways. Credit tightened. Equipment financing became harder to obtain. The calculus that Dale Sievert had been describing for years, trade up, get newer equipment, stop running old iron, became, for many farmers in Marshall County, simply impossible. You could not trade up if you could not get a loan. You could not get a loan if your banker was sitting in a building that had just watched its capital base evaporate. The old iron was not a choice anymore. It was the only option. And the old iron needed parts. In March of 2009, a man named Virgil Hassel, who farmed 740 acres in the western part of the county and ran a mixed fleet of equipment spanning 3 decades of manufacturing, came to Emmett Holloway's farm with a problem that was not, strictly speaking, a single problem. It was a cascade. His 1975 International Harvester 1586 had blown a starter. His 1980 John Deere 4640 had an alternator that was putting out irregular voltage and would fail completely within days. His 1978 case, 2390, had a voltage regulator that had already failed and was running on what Virgil described as hope and inertia. Planting was 6 weeks away. Emmett walked Virgil into the shed and turned on the lights. Let me tell you about that moment, because Virgil Hassel described it afterward in terms that stayed with people in Marshall County for a long time. Virgil said the shed looked, at first, like organized chaos. Then his eyes adjusted and he started to see the system. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. Everything was labeled in Emmett's handwriting, which was small and precise. The labels were not fancy. They were pieces of masking tape with model numbers and years written in pencil. But they were accurate and they were complete. And as Virgil walked the length of the first shelf, he realized that he was looking at the electrical history of American agricultural equipment from approximately 1965 to 2001, organized by manufacturer and model year, containing components that had not been commercially available for a decade or more. He said it was like walking into a room where someone had been quietly saving the world for 20 years and hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Emmett had the starter for the 1586. He had it as a complete rebuilt unit, already assembled and tested, sitting on a shelf next to 2 others in the same configuration. He had the alternator components for the 4640, not a complete unit, but the rotor and the rectifier assembly that were failing, which he could install in the existing housing in about 40 minutes. The voltage regulator for the case 2390 was on a shelf in a coffee can with 11 others of the same type, because Emmett had noticed years ago that that particular regulator was a common failure point on case equipment of that era and had accumulated a stock of them accordingly. Virgil Hassel's 3 machines were back in operational condition within 2 days. The total cost to Virgil was $210 in parts. The commercial alternative, if commercial alternatives had existed, would have been somewhere between $1,800 and $2,400, and would have taken weeks to arrive. Virgil told people, he told them specifically and in detail, which is not how farmers usually talk about things, but is how Virgil talked when something had genuinely impressed him. He told them about the shed and the shelves and the labels and the coffee cans. He told them about Emmett's system and Emmett's knowledge and the 20 years of collecting that had made it possible. He told them the story, the way you tell a story when you want people to understand that something important happened. By the time planting season arrived in 2009, Emmett Holloway had more requests for help than he could comfortably handle. He was 67 years old. He was not running a business. He was a farmer with a shed and a ledger and 40 years of knowledge, and he was being asked to be the electrical parts supplier for a significant portion of Marshall County's aging equipment fleet. He handled it the way he handled everything, which was methodically and without complaint, and with a quiet attention to the work that the people who watched him found almost hypnotic. Now, let me tell you about Dale Sievert in the spring of 2009, because Dale Sievert's spring of 2009 was a different experience from Emmett Holloway's spring of 2009, and the contrast is instructive. The dealership's service department was busy in the spring of 2009, but it was busy in an uncomfortable way. The new equipment sales that Dale had built his service model around had slowed dramatically. The farmers who could not get financing were not buying new tractors. The farmers who could have bought new tractors were not buying them because they were uncertain about the next year and the year after that. The service department was seeing more of the old equipment that Dale had spent years telling people to replace, and it was seeing it with problems that the dealership's parts inventory was not equipped to solve. 3 times in March of 2009, Dale Sievert's service department had to tell a farmer that a part was unavailable, and the lead time was 4 to 8 weeks, and the cost was going to be significant. 3 times in March of 2009, those farmers drove from the dealership to Emmett Holloway's farm and drove home with their equipment running. Kevin, the parts manager, was keeping track. He was not keeping track officially. He was keeping track the way a person keeps track of things that seem important, even when nobody has asked them to. By his informal count, between January and June of 2009, at least 19 farmers had come to the dealership for legacy electrical parts, been told the parts were unavailable or the lead time was unacceptable, and then gone to Emmett Holloway. Kevin mentioned this to Dale Sievert in May. Dale said the farmers would learn eventually that used parts were a false economy. Kevin went back to his desk. The summer of 2009 was when it became impossible to ignore. A man named Clement Vandermeer, who farmed 1,100 acres in the county and was, by local standards, a large and successful operation, had a 1982 John Deere 4850. That went down during soybean harvest with an alternator failure that caused a cascade of electrical problems across 3 connected systems. The machine was in the middle of a field at 7 in the evening. Clement called the dealership emergency line. The dealership had a service truck out within 2 hours, which was genuinely responsive, and the service technician diagnosed the problem accurately and efficiently. The problem was that the alternator rotor had failed, and the replacement rotor was not in the dealership's inventory, and the distributor did not have it, and the manufacturer's parts network listed it as a low-stock item with a 2-week lead time. The service technician called Dale Sievert. Dale Sievert called 2 other distributors. Neither had the part. The machine sat in the field. Clement Vandermeer called Emmett Holloway at 9:30 that evening. Emmett drove to Clement's field with his truck and his tool bag and a rotor he had pulled from a blown alternator in 1997 and rebuilt on a winter evening in 2003 and tested and placed on a shelf with a piece of masking tape that said 4850 alternator rotor, tested good November 3rd. He installed it in the field by the light of his truck's headlights and Clement's combine's work lights, and Clement Vandermeer finished his soybean harvest that night. The service technician from the dealership was still there when Emmett arrived. He watched Emmett work. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Where did you get that rotor?" Emmett told him. The technician was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many of those do you have?" Emmett said he had 3 more of that specific type and probably a dozen rotors overall for various models. The technician nodded slowly, with the expression of a man recalculating something important. That technician's name was Marcus. He was 31 years old and had grown up in Marshalltown and had worked at the dealership for 7 years and was good at his job in the specific, technical sense of being good at diagnosing and repairing modern agricultural equipment. He was not good, and had no reason to be good, at the kind of legacy component knowledge that Emmett possessed. But he recognized what he was seeing, and he drove back to the dealership that night and told Dale Sievert about it in detail. Dale Sievert listened. He did not say much. He thanked Marcus for the report and said he'd think about it. Marcus went home. Dale sat in his office for a while with the lights on. Let me tell you about what Dale Sievert was thinking. because it matters to the story that he was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built his understanding of his business on a set of assumptions that had been reasonable for a long time and were now, quietly and irreversibly, becoming unreasonable. He had assumed that the market would move toward newer equipment and that the legacy parts problem would solve itself as older machines were retired. He had assumed that farmers who couldn't afford new equipment would find a way to afford it eventually, or would leave farming, or would find some commercial solution that the market would provide. He had not assumed that a 67-year-old farmer with a shed full of old parts would become, in the absence of any commercial solution, the effective electrical parts supply chain for a significant portion of the county's agricultural fleet. He had not assumed it because it had not occurred to him that it was possible. That is the thing about Emmett Holloway's 20 years of collecting. It was not visible as a system until the system it was compensating for failed. While Meridian was open, while the commercial supply chain was functioning, Emmett's shed was a curiosity. It was the kind of thing that got you called eccentric and got your family called the museum family and got the service manager at the dealership to tell you that your parts were scrap. The value of the shed was invisible because the need for the shed was invisible. The need was always there, latent, waiting. It just needed the supply chain to fail before it became apparent. Gus Holloway, sitting in that same shed in 1949, telling his 7-year-old son that the man who knows what something is worth when it's broken is the only man who's ever truly free, had understood this. Emmett had understood it. Dale Sievert was understanding it now, in his office at 11 o'clock on a September night in 2009, and the understanding was not comfortable. The following morning, Dale Sievert drove to Emmett Holloway's farm. Let me tell you about that visit, because it is the part of the story that people in Marshall County tell most often, and the reason they tell it most often is that it went differently than most people expected. Dale arrived at 8 in the morning. Emmett was in the machine shed doing something to the hydraulic system on his own tractor. Dale knocked on the door frame and Emmett looked up and said, "Come in." And Dale came in and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets while Emmett finished what he was doing, which took about 4 minutes. Then Emmett set down his wrench and looked at Dale. Dale said, "I owe you an apology." Emmett waited. Dale said, "I told people your parts were a prayer. I was wrong. I've been watching what you've done for the last 3 years, and I was wrong." Emmett nodded. He did not say, "You were wrong," or "I told you so," or anything that would have been satisfying in the small, petty way that satisfying things sometimes are. He said, "What do you need?" Dale Sievert looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I need to know what you've got, and I need to know if there's a way to work together, because I've got farmers coming to me with problems I can't solve, and you can apparently solve them, and that seems like a situation we should address." Emmett thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Come look at the shed." He walked Dale through the shed the way a librarian walks someone through a library, not showing off, just explaining the system. He showed Dale the shelves and the labels and the coffee cans and the spiral-bound ledger. He showed Dale the rebuilt units and the component bins and the test bench he had built himself from salvaged parts in 1991. He showed Dale the section of the shed dedicated to components he had identified as likely future failures based on his knowledge of which parts tended to go on, which machines, at which mileage intervals. He explained the logic behind the organization and the logic behind the collection and the logic behind the pricing, which was parts at cost and nothing for labor. Dale Sievert walked through the shed for about 20 minutes without saying much. Then he stopped at a shelf near the back and looked at a row of rebuilt starter units, maybe 15 of them, all labeled, all tested, all ready to install. He said, "How long did it take you to build all this?" Emmett said, "About 40 years. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I called your parts scrap." Emmett said, "You didn't know what they were." That was all Emmett said about it. He did not belabor it. He did not extract anything from it. He said it as a statement of fact, not as an accusation, and then he moved on to discussing how they might work together, which was the practical question in front of them and the one Emmett was more interested in. What they worked out over the next several weeks was an informal arrangement. Not a contract, not a business partnership, not anything with lawyers or paperwork. An arrangement in the way that arrangements work in small farming communities, which is to say on the basis of handshakes and mutual understanding and the knowledge that both parties would be seeing each other at the Lutheran church and the Farm Bureau meeting and the co-op for the rest of their lives. The dealership would refer farmers with legacy electrical problems to Emmett. Emmett would provide parts and service at his standard terms, which were cost plus nothing. The dealership would stop telling people that Emmett's parts were scrap. It was a small arrangement. It was also, for the farmers of Marshall County, an important one. Over the next 4 years, between 2009 and 2013, Emmett Holloway provided rebuilt or repaired electrical components to 67 different farming operations in Marshall County. The number is not approximate. It is from the ledger. 67 operations. Some of them came once. Some of them came every season. The total value of parts he provided, calculated at commercial replacement prices, was somewhere north of $180,000. The total he collected at his cost, plus nothing pricing, was $22,400. The difference, roughly $160,000, was the value of 20 years of collecting things that other people had thrown away, expressed in the language that Dale Sievert understood best. Emmett Holloway did not think of it in those terms. He thought of it as Tuesday. Let me tell you about the last time Emmett Holloway rebuilt a starter motor, because the last time is part of the story and it belongs here. It was April of 2014. Emmett was 72 years old. His hands had developed the tremor that comes sometimes with age, not severe, but enough that the fine work of winding armatures was slower than it used to be and required more concentration. He was rebuilding a starter for a 1979 John Deere 4440, belonging to a young farmer named Aaron Briggs, who'd bought a neighboring farm the previous year and was running it on equipment that was older than he was. Aaron was 24 years old and had grown up in the county and had heard about Emmett Holloway the way young people in Marshall County heard about Emmett Holloway, which was as a fact of the landscape, like the river and the county road and the grain elevator. Aaron came to pick up the starter and found Emmett at the test bench. Emmett installed the finished unit in the test rig, connected the leads, and hit the switch. The starter spun up immediately, strong and even, and ran for 30 seconds while Emmett watched the ammeter and the voltmeter